Margaret's content world shattered the day she learned her daughter Yvette had been murdered. This had to be a mistake. Surely it wasn't her daughter they were talking about. Yvette was away at college beginning her new life, not lying in a morgue. This had to be a mistake. The next day, Margaret and her husband Frank walked the premonitory halls of the coroner's offices. Their footsteps clanged the ominous sound of a death toll, while everyone seemed to avoid eye contact as if they knew what awaited them at the end of the hall. Margaret's feet grew painfully heavy, as if she were walking through molten lava, while Frank was doing all he could just to keep himself moving forward. He held Margaret's hand and could feel it slipping out of his, but he didn't have the strength to keep it in its grasp. Frank didn't realize he was walking alone until he reached the door, turned around, and looked for his wife. "I can't. I'm sorry. I just can't," said Margaret. She couldn't even look at him as the shame of her cowardice held her in her tracks. Maybe if she didn't go in, it wouldn't be true, and she was right all the time. This was a mistake. Frank entered the tomb where his daughter's body lay in repose, with the putrid smell of death all around him. As the sheet was pulled back, he closed his eyes, remembering what Yvette looked like the last time he saw her, and slowly looked down. What he saw took his breath away. It wasn't just the sight of her lifeless body, but realizing this was the body of his daughter. He heard himself gasp and wondered where the loud spasms that echoed throughout the room were coming. He was astounded to realize they were coming from him. Frank had never heard himself make a sound like that before. He felt a hand on his shoulder pulling him away as the sheet that covered Yvette's body was slowly recoiled. At this moment, he wasn't going to be the strong man everyone needed and expected. He was a grieving father whose daughter's life had been cut short for reasons he couldn't begin to comprehend. Frank couldn't stop his tears and the anguish that enveloped him, and he didn't try to. He didn't care about Margaret waiting outside, what the people still in the room thought, or what else they had to do. He even forgot about Diane and Douglas, their other two children anxiously waiting at home. This was his child, and he was overwhelmed with a grief that took him to his knees. The minute she saw him, Margaret could tell from the look on his face. In the span of a few moments, he looked as if he had aged 10 years. Frank nodded in acknowledgement that their daughter was truly dead and embraced Margaret, but she couldn't respond. Her arms dangled at her side like a rag doll. A loud wail emanated from her small, frail body, and she began to shake as Frank held on to her. He thought if he let her go, she would break apart into a million pieces. The ride home was long and quiet. Frank didn't fathom how long it would be before Margaret would actually be able to say the words, "My daughter is dead." A part of Margaret died that day with Yvette. The perpetrators of the violence against her daughter were never caught. And if that weren't enough, she was also waylaid with guilt for neglecting Diane as she prepared for her own high school graduation and first year of college. Margaret actually resented her for daring to go on with her life like nothing had happened. Had she forgotten Yvette was gone? Douglas, who she always babied, looked at her with yearning and confusion. She could no longer reach out to him for fear something would happen to him, too, and he would no longer be there. Margaret didn't want another person telling her that her daughter was in a better place, or what stage of grief she was in, or this too will pass, or worse yet, she should be grateful she had her in her life for almost 20 years. Grateful. She didn't want to hear any more cliches people said during times like this. Margaret often just sat in Yvette's room, trying to feel her presence, just wanting to see her smile, touch her skin, or stroke her hair. Margaret hardly slept at night and woke up tired. Getting through the day was exhausting and only ushered in another sleepless night. She wanted to sleep, hoping she could at least have Yvette in her dreams, but was afraid to wake up and find out her nightmare was real. She was trapped in an agonizing cycle she just couldn't escape. Frank didn't know what to do to help Margaret. She always had her own way of dealing with things without him. Why should this be any different? Besides, someone had to be a parent to Diane and Douglas. After months of wandering around like a zombie, Margaret finally reached the end of the road. She crawled up the stairs, opened the door to Yvette's room, and fell across her dear child's bed, sobbing. She clung to it as if it was Yvette. and she was trying to save her from drowning. But it wasn't Yvette who was drowning, but Margaret. Margaret didn't realize she had fallen into a deep sleep in Yvette's bed and was startled by Douglas standing over her. "Mom, are you all right?" he asked. Shaking off the respite of her slumber for the first time, it came out. "She's dead, isn't she? Yvette's dead." The sound of hearing herself say those words unleashed a wave of grievous heartache she could no longer outrun. Margaret sobbed without restraint in the arms of her young son, who was still trying to comprehend the tragedy that was consuming his family and seemed to have swallowed his mother whole. This was the beginning of the new normal for Margaret. It was a time she found comfort in the arms of a child. She found strength in the one she thought was the weakest. She now allowed herself to move through a relentless grief that had chased her down and she could no longer outrun. There is a time for everything, a season for every activity under heaven. There is a time to grieve. It's a time of irreversible emptiness that cannot be filled. Margaret never fully recovered from losing Yvette. The best she could do was just go on and live through a season whose waves of grief would come and go as it chose. But what was born out of a season of grief was a time to embrace a season with a different normal she never saw coming.